Hi there, everybody. My name is Kelly Barner. I'm the head of content and operations here at Art of Procurement, and I'm going to be your half facilitator, half participant in today's live conversation. So, as you know, you are here today to hear us talk about more recently discovered and defined opportunities to elevate services spend management. This is based on a second wave of research that we have conducted. We did the first survey in 2023. We did the second revised one, but based around the same concepts in late 2024. We published, of course, the white paper resulting from the first one. And in just a couple of weeks, we will have the updated findings available in a brand new white paper to start off the new year by giving you some additional insights. Now, before I bring in today's guests, I just want to take you through a couple of housekeeping things. If this happens to be your first Art of Procurement webinar, first of all, welcome. We're thrilled to have you. But these events are a little bit different. You will not see any slides today. What you will see is a live conversation that we have practiced and planned, but not scripted. And it's a conversation that you have an opportunity to participate in. So if you're here live and you look at the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a nice big chat panel. I will be keeping an eye on that as we go through today's conversation. You don't need to wait till the end. We don't hold off on those questions and comments. I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through today's conversation. So feel free to put in your thoughts and comments at any time. Now, without further delay, I would like to bring up on screen my guest. Gordon Donovan is the Vice President of Research, Procurement and External Workforce at SAP. Gordon, thank you so much for being with me today.
It's a pleasure, Kelly. It's a pleasure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I hope you're all having great days. It's pretty early where I live, but an absolute pleasure to be here.
Extremely early. You have to be very passionate about procurement to be enthusiastic at 5 o'clock in the morning local time. So we're glad it's you because you bring the enthusiasm with you.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm a bit croaky, it's because it's 5 a.m.
You haven't had time to practice yet. We'll have you all warmed up by the end of this session to head off into the rest of your day. Now, Gordon, if people do know you, they may actually know you for a lot outside of services spend management. You're very good at not just gathering and resharing, but also reading and digesting a lot of the procurement research, regardless of where it comes from. And so that gives you a really broad perspective that you not only bring to our efforts to build these surveys and do research and analysis, but on procurement more generally. So I want to give you sort of a broad opportunity to share based on the most recent research you've been reading. Are there any current observations about procurement, sort of big picture, that you think it makes sense to open the conversation with?
I mean, big picture, one of the things that I've been seeing probably over the last few years is that the general sort of confidence levels that the rest of the business has in procurement has basically been steadily rising over the last 2 or 3 years. As you know, we do a research piece with the Economist Impact group every year, and we've been tracking that over the last 3 years, and I've got halfway numbers through again this year, and basically it's continuing a similar sort of trend. So I think that's good. That there's a confidence levels are good, and that confidence is because I think procurement has been delivering on its promises. I think I recently shared. I think it was an article written by Rob Hanfield about trust, and one of the pieces of research I remember reading from the 90s was from a writer called Mari Sacco, who dimensioned trust in 3 ways. And the lowest level of trust is about keeping your promises. I think procurement's been keeping its promises. I think that's a good thing. And as that confidence levels rises up, that has 2 knock-on effects. One, it means that when we want to do different things, when we want to transform, when we want to invest in technology, then because we've been delivering, we get that budget. We see in various other pieces of research budgets being out there. The second one, and the listeners on the line can decide if this is a good or bad thing. It means that we get more stuff to do. The problem of being successful is that you get given more stuff. Now, I personally think it's a great thing. It also means that we get given different stuff, more complex stuff, and the complexity is where the fun is, right? Because solving problems is something that I think procurement is very, very good at. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is there was a piece of research from PwC last year, and it said something like 96% of organizations had some kind of source to pay technology already delivered. I think it was mainly focused around P2P. So that technology adoption has allowed organizations to become more effective and more efficient. But I think from a procurement perspective, there's still opportunities for us to be more impactful. And those are things, the value beyond savings. Those are the risk reductions. There's the Hackett Key Issues report that came out last year. It's out this year as well. I'm not too sure if it's been generally published yet or not. I have seen it. And the number one and number two are basically cost reduction, but supply continuity. My old procurement teacher from 1980 said to me the first obligation of procurement professionals is to ensure supply continuity, to make sure you keep getting what you get. And everything else is kind of, all serving that same kind of problem. So I think that is important. Is thinking about the value beyond savings, and importantly, and we'll have this discussion today, I think, how and what we measure, and I think that's important. And the last piece I'll say is around, many organizations talk about being customer centric. They have this customer centricity. So what does that mean for procurement? I think it's tempting for us to think about our customers as being our internal stakeholders, and undoubtedly they are part.
Sure.
But again, I think if we get to this value beyond savings, one of the things that I see and I read a lot is to recognize the actual end customer of your organization. So if you want to be fully aligned with your organization, thinking about the end customer that your organization serves and putting them central to your procurement strategy, and recognize the things that we do in procurement, how does it impact the end customer? Now, I think once we start thinking like that alignment with the business, that value beyond savings becomes simpler, not simple, simpler, because we have them in mind as opposed to other goals. Those are probably broader things that I'd say is top of mind.
And this is hard, Gordon, because I know what we're going to talk about today, and I've already heard most of the major themes that we're going to come back and focus on from a services spend management perspective in a lot of what you teased, which I think is interesting because it means regardless of the specific findings, observations, recommendations we focus on today around services spend, it sounds like a lot of these things are going to apply to all spend. So kind of regardless, these are lessons that we've drawn from services focused data, but they're going to apply all over the place. Now, before we jump in, one of the key things that we did this year, this is one of our additions. Yes, there were some questions we asked about all services spend. Doesn't matter what kind, doesn't matter what structure. But we also had sections where we broke out and went through sort of a series of short repetitions to understand the differences around specific types of services. And that's where some of our really interesting observations come in. So I want to set the stage as we begin. We had 3 different types of service categories: routine services, ad hoc services without a predefined scope, and ad hoc services that do have a predefined scope. Why was it so important or so potentially interesting for us to specifically break out different service types into those categories?
I mean, for me, we wanted to, and speaking as someone who's managed lots of different service categories and led different service categories, it's recognizing, I think, what we wanted to find out was, do people treat different types of services contracts differently? And if so, what are the things that's going to differentiate them? So last year we asked similar questions about how broadly and how broad service contracts were managed, payment mechanisms, and then how purchases were actually made. And we wanted to see if there are any differences between the different types of services, let's say like routine, like the preventative maintenance, like cleaning, the stuff that probably everybody will have some kind of contract for. Are those things differently managed? The different payment mechanism, which therefore has an indication on risk, as we've talked about, and then how do people buy from those contracts? Do they actually buy from those contracts, or is it almost like, well, we set the contract up and off it goes, or is there some kind of activity that happens to say, hey, we want some of this stuff, which obviously for the ad hoc stuff, that's where we would expect some stuff. And I guess that we wanted to really delve into that, because last year I think we had something like that 50% of organizations used emails and phone calls. And so we wanted to go and say, okay, is this for a specific, because it would make sense if it was for a specific type.
Sure.
But not if it was like a planned set of things, like why are you using an email and a phone call for that as opposed to this?
Yeah.
We wanted to understand that a little bit better.
So you talked about the fact that when we talk about routine services, we mean facilities, maintenance, we might mean janitorial, my personal favorite, pest control, going back to my practitioner days, right? Can you just take us through the delineation between ad hoc services with no scope and ad hoc services with a defined scope? What would be examples of each of those?
Yeah, the difference I'd say is the ones with a defined scope, with a predetermined scope, are like activity-based things. So you know exactly what you want, but you don't know when you want it, as opposed to, so things like couriers. Yeah, we want someone to take something from here to there. I live in Australia. It's summer right now. Not summer where you are.
Definitely not.
Not where you are. Snow removal. Certain parts of the world. Not so much needed in Australia. I'll be honest with you. We don't let that many snow removal.
It's okay, Gordon. I'll forgive you.
Bizarrely though, there is snow. What's the opposite of removal? Putting snow in place. There is actually in because we have ski fields about 2 hours north of where I am. The ski fields, and they need snow.
I thought you meant Hallmark Christmas movies, Gordon, but okay. Ski slopes works too.
Yeah, ski slopes works too. Yeah. And whereas obviously the routine, routine and repetitive, like cleaning, pest control, janitorial services, and ad hoc means that it's just, we don't really know. The time frame is not known. You just know you're going to need it at some point.
Yeah.
So you could put them in place like consultancy contracts. Those, you don't really know the scope. You might set therefore a schedule of rates. Could be project-based consulting. But you use when it's needed, and you kind of call it off almost. So those are kind of the three ways that we looked at, when we were kicking around going, well, what are the different types? Do most fall into these kind of things? And there might be some that we missed out, but we think that's probably going to gather, probably most services contracts can fall into one of those three types.
And we did find some interesting differences and lacks of difference between those different service categories. But before we get to that, one of the things you notice we did not define as a category is strategic services. That we asked about the strategy level of services across the board. And we asked, so what are the things that help you decide whether or not this is strategic spend? And basically what we came down to with some round numbers, about half of the respondents said that the level of impact a service has on key corporate initiatives determines how strategic it is. Somewhere in the 20s, category value, contract value, those are very similar. But then the last one with 8% is proximity to end customers. And so when you were talking earlier about who is your customer, is it your internal stakeholder that you want to be happy with the procurement process? Or is it the end person, whether corporate or personal consumer that's buying the good or service? What do you think about that? Technically, it's 7.7, but that 8% of respondents making the determination of how strategic a service is by proximity to end customers.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think there's an opportunity to really rethink how we let services contracts and determine it. So let's say that the impact on key corporate initiatives, I was really happy to see that as the top answer. That makes some sense. And I was happy because it meant that people were thinking about the impact and the alignment internally with the business more so than the size of the contract, the category value numbers that people were doing it. So it was less around segmentation from Kraliyek or something along those lines, and more around internal alignment, which is, I think that's exactly right. I just think that I know when I've let services contracts before now, one of the things that determined that was, so I'll give you a real example. When I worked for a train operating company, we looked at what customers actually valued about a train service, and surprisingly, the things that they value about the train service is that, number one, the trains actually turn up. Who knew?
That is a really good idea. I hope you pass that up the chain. that
It's a
information.
good insight, isn't it? So therefore, when the train's actually turning up, what does that mean? It means that anything to do with maintenance of the train is going to make that strategically important for our customers for it to turn up. Two, they cared about the trains being there on time. Who knew that people like timetables. So there's a maintenance issue there as well. So it kind of reinforced the whole piece around the maintenance issue. The drivers weren't part of our remit, but it also meant that the drivers turning up was important. Number three, that they wanted the trains to be clean. Therefore, anything to do with cleaning of trains, and this is where it's important to kind of really understand your customer, the end customer, because they cared substantially more about the trains being clean than they did about the stations being clean. There was a really big difference. It was something like 75% trains clean, 25% stations clean. So when you start to think about what are the things that I want to take direct control over, what are the things that matter most for us, and that spurred an insourcing, outsourcing discussion around things like maintenance, around things like train cleaning. And those are really important strategic discussions to have. So that made all of those types of services very, very strategic for us to make us go, right, well, we're going to treat them differently. And those strategic type contracts, those are where you actually do turn around and go, insource, outsource. If our customers are saying, that's the reason why I take your service, then I want to have as much control over that as I possibly can within the realm of what's going to make it financially sustainable for your organization as well. And that's certainly, having those types of strategic conversations, for me, that's value beyond savings.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because if we take that example and sort of pull it back to a traditional point of view, maybe the person that's in charge of operations at the train company is Susan, right? And what Susan actually cares about is having very few meetings with procurement. So maybe Susan's really happy that she's not having to meet with procurement very much. So you have a very satisfied customer, but the people riding the train may still be incredibly unhappy that that train is not clean. So if we take that first step to, okay, Susan is our immediate internal customer. We never bother her. She loves us. We get great marks from her on all the internal customer sat surveys. We're doing awesome. But the end customer that actually determines whether the whole company is successful may be incredibly unhappy because you're measuring success and value on very different frameworks.
And I think it's also important when we think about how organizations manage contracts, and we'll come to what they put in, the KPIs, right, and the SLAs. It needs to also think about how do we bring our end customer satisfaction
Yes.
into some of those KPIs. Because again, when we think about how aligned we are with the business, it has to be being aligned with our end customer as well, because everybody talks about this customer centricity. The customer is at the center of everything that we do. We in procurement need to think that way too. I think when we do start thinking and putting that individual or that group of people at the center of what we do, I think it does change the way, it changes our perception on what becomes important, and also therefore what we measure in the outputs from our contracts.
Yeah. Now, before we really get deep into the KPIs and outcomes, one of the interesting areas where we did not really find a different by service type is how those purchases are being made. So across the board, very close, we saw 60% are using purchase order invoice through ERP. You had about 25-30% using that email, telephone, or there wasn't a consistent way. Would you have expected to see, based on how we've defined these service categories, differences, or does it make sense for this set of information that they're really all being tactically bought in the same way with I mean, really, when you take out variability, the exact same percentages by purchase type?
Yeah, I mean, I did expect to see differences between them, but I would also expect to see an alignment between what's being managed or how things are being managed and how things are being paid with the instrument of enacting that with the supplier. So, for instance, there are some things that lend themselves much more to time and materials based stuff.
Right.
Yeah, you can't. So therefore, if it's time and materials, you're essentially talking about a variable price, which is fine. You'd have a variable price for something that you'd have an unknown scope for. You wouldn't. I wouldn't expect for that to be a fixed cost, because if you're fixing a cost against an unknown scope, I have no idea how that calculation is made, because you have two variables that you're multiplying together to become a fixed, which suggests that there's a third variable being put in there, which is just in case, and you're paying more than you possibly want to.
Yeah.
So I would expect to see an alignment, and I think in some of these instances, the alignment wasn't as I was expecting, which again I think probably goes to there's an opportunity here for us to do a better job. And you know, look, the drama with services, and we talked about this in our kind of talks, you know, pre-show talks. The problem with services, that when you think about goods versus services, services are very obviously are intangible. It's tough to actually
Yes.
touch out, but it's also someone's opinion of pest control. What makes good pest control is not someone else's. Yeah, you know, never seeing them, only seeing them certain times of the year. Complete eradication versus some other form of not seeing them. Those are all very much the beauty.
Yeah.
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That is
Yep.
very, very true. And so it's tough, Owen, because when you think about a good, it's either there or it's not. It
Yeah.
either works or it doesn't. And so services are tougher. So sometimes I think they don't necessarily get the attention that is deserved.
And that variability, that beauty in the eye of the beholder might also be why we found, again, regardless of the category of service, 20% of respondents said that they're not formally measuring the outcomes delivered. So
That
we heard that, like, sometimes there's KPIs in a contract, sometimes they're getting informal stakeholder feedback. Again, totally sort of ignoring that voice of the ultimate end consumer, but that we've still got 20% of cases, or services, I should say, where there is no formal outcome capture being done.
and that surprised me when I looked at these numbers. I also looked at it and went, okay, how are organizations doing the risk reward thing? Because that's more kind of thing. And it was 56% of organizations, which is up from 50% last year,
Yep.
had a risk and reward. And mainly it was a risk and reward around failure to meet KPIs. But then when you look at the measures in the different types of contracts, all three of them were lower than that 56%, which basically says your main method of, and it's your choice, carrot or stick, right? In this, but most of them were penalties only, rather than gain share. And we can talk about the need to actually have reciprocal rates when you've got an imbalance of power between supplier and buyer. But I do think that there's therefore that gap between. I think so. Let me just look at some numbers. It was routine was around 35%. Ad hoc was 25%, and activity-based stuff was 42%. Those are the numbers that organizations were using KPIs to measure. But everybody was saying that 56% of people said we use KPIs as our main kind of thing. It's like, well, there's a disconnect, because you're not necessarily doing that.
Yeah.
You know, interestingly, and look, the word interesting, you might be doing a lot of heavy lifting because it's numbers, so it's interesting to me. I did some deep dive cuts, and we talked about the way that organizations used purchase, whether they use a purchase order or invoice against contract, or services procurement platform, or emails and phone calls. I isolated services procurement platform, and just to see what did that do. And you know what it did, Kelly? What was interesting
What did it do?
was, when you isolate the ones who use services procurement platform, the percentages of people who used SLAs and KPIs to manage their performance went up.
Okay.
And it went up, and I got the numbers. It went up. Here we go. Routine goes from 35% to 61%. Ad hoc goes 28% from 25%. Again, ad hoc is tough to manage a service level
That is
agreement,
tough.
service levels, when you don't know what it is you're doing. And the activity-driven stuff went from 42% to 55%. So, and I'm guessing that it's because you've now actually got a way of measuring. So potentially the issue is that there's not, when you're using a purchase order, it is tough to measure service level agreements on a purchase order when you've got a system that's designed to measure and manage KPIs. it drives that type of behavior.
And it a little bit connects back to sort of your broad overview where let's just go out on a limb. I know now we're sort of, I'm making up a narrative version of this, but the organizations that were able to get approval to bring in a services specific platform had presumably been at the very least keeping their promises and therefore were able to get approval. So there's almost connection between the maturity and the frameworks required to help procurement make good commitments and stick to those and deliver against them and prove that they delivered against them, to then also being able to get the budget allocation that puts you into a system that lets you take your own performance to the next level. It does start to feel like sort of a fortuitous cycle.
Yeah, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is that the right phrase?
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
There you go. You see, but no, that I think is a really good point. Is that choosing your investments wisely. Problem now is I've got a Raiders of the Lost Ark thing around him. He chose poorly. Choosing those investments wisely, and how you're going to invest and where you're going to invest and what you're going to invest in is going to return significant gains for you. Certainly, then it does mean if you're actively measuring the KPIs, then the mechanism that you have to drive risk and reward is now at least being able to be used. The problem that I think we have at the moment is that you can't use it because you're not measuring it. So until you actually start to measure it, that main way that organizations are doing. And I do think that when I looked at the main risk and reward piece, I do think we're missing a trick there. I think you're having it all just penalty as opposed to, and let's be clear, there was again 20%, only 20% had a reciprocal gain share, so it was both parties win. And there was 9% had a bonus. One of the things that I'm seeing more broadly from a trend that's happening is many organizations now are thinking about how do I reshore things closer.
Yep.
You're going to see an increase potentially in services type contracts where you're going to try and almost put a middle person in because you're going to need to have more suppliers that you're actually doing business with. The supplier centricity and the supplier relationship is going to increase. You need to become a customer of choice because where you've got scarcity of supply, you need to ensure that the supplier wants to supply to you. So just ask yourself the question, what would make you want to do something for somebody else? There has to be something in it for you. And at the moment, I don't think that there's something in it for us being contained to, well, we're not going to take things away from you. Is that going to motivate people to do more, or is it motivating people just to do exactly what they're putting? And for some contracts, that's absolutely right. All I want is you to do this. I don't need necessarily my stationery provider to be innovative in the way that it delivers it.
Just print it straight.
Yeah.
And make sure it doesn't rip when I tear it off the pad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas other things I might want, I want the latest. I want to understand because, again, thinking about my end customer, what's my end customer want? How am I going to help service my end customer? I think those things are important to have all of these things kind of aligned together.
I do think there's also a bit of a hand tip to presumably put into a contract. These are the penalties that we will act upon if you miss performance expectations.
Yep.
And then the rewards are missing because if we were just measuring, not worrying about good and bad, missed versus exceeded, just measuring performance consistently in the background, you would think that would all play out a lot more naturally. Whereas it's almost like we're saying, if you miss this, we reserve the right to come back and renegotiate. But there has to be some sort of discrete signal to the supplier. Yet this isn't actually being managed internally at the level of detail that would be required to give you just sort of a performance assessment across the board versus just thinking of missed SLAs.
I think so. And I think the other thing as well is you're sending this, as you're saying, you're sending the signal to the suppliers as to what's important to you and what's not important to you. I was having this conversation with somebody the other day and they were saying, oh, they've missed this. Okay, and what have we done with it? Well, we haven't really done anything with it. Well, then the message that you basically send is you don't care about the thing that's being missed. So ignore the fact that legally at some point later on, when you do turn around and care about it and you try and use it as a way to get out of the contract, ignore the fact that you probably by your actions deemed that acceptance already. Not a lawyer, just for the avoidance
Yeah.
that I'm not a lawyer, but I've seen case law where it says, no, we're not taking it.
Yeah.
The message that you send to the suppliers doesn't matter in the first place. Well, if that doesn't matter, what are the other things that don't matter? So you've got to be really clear, I think, about the things that you put in from an SLA perspective.
Yeah. One of the things that was most interesting to me in going through this process, and this actually ties indirectly to a question I see John has put into the chat, was that, we build this out with all the different questions and the different types of services. But as you started looking through the data, you were sort of building out this, I don't know, I'm in procurement, so I think in tables. But like, okay, you have a scope and type of service. You have some sort of level of strategic value or importance assigned to that service. You have your method or lack thereof of outcome capture, and then you have the pricing mechanism. And so you have these pieces, but for each row in my imaginary mental table, those things have to logically align. So you can't have a pricing mechanism that is performance determined if you're not measuring performance capturing outcomes and have very specific contract KPIs, right? That's a simple example of something that's not going to align. When we think about those things, so the scope or type of service, how strategic it is, how we're capturing outcomes, and how we're negotiating pricing. If procurement is currently missing the opportunity to align those four things for whatever the service is, where do you start? Because it would be very simple to say, well, just, redefine the scope of the service or something. But I'm not sure starting at the beginning of that 4-part sequence is actually the best way to have an impact. Where would you recommend procurement start if they're getting the opportunity, a service is up for renegotiation, recontract, and they want to try to get those 4 pieces aligned in your typical sourcing process? Where's actually the place to start?
For me, everything starts at the scope, to be completely honest with you, because you need to understand what's in, what's out, what works, what doesn't. The value kind of comes back to that. Alignment on the scope. I used to run a bunch of training programs, and I used to get people, as a bit of an exercise, to draw me a picture based on a written scope. So I used to just use words.
Okay.
And it was something like draw 2 half moons in the middle of a page. Actually, no, it was in the middle of a page, draw 2 half moons, then draw a straight line between the 2 half moons, then draw 2 ellipses. And basically what I was getting people to do was to draw a face. And we used to put pictures up. We used to put all the pictures up around of everything that draws. And occasionally someone would draw a face. But a lot of the other time they would be drawing something completely different. Now, what that tells us is that, and I keep coming back to the word alignment. I think it's absolutely crucial. It shows us that when you use one method of communication, then when someone interprets that method in terms of how they're seeing something or hearing something or reading something, then the outcome can be completely different. So when we start to think about value, I think the first piece of value is all about ensuring that everything's aligned. And the bit that I kind of started off talking about a little bit was, well, who do you align to?
Yeah.
And this is, for me, where I think the biggest value comes back to. Let's align to what the end customer is wanting, and aligning to what we are taking our end customer towards. A lot of people in sales and manufacturing will turn around and say to you that what's the line? Henry Ford said, if we only ever asked the customer what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
That's right.
So there's an element of recognizing what the customer wanted was actually a faster mode of transport, not a faster horse. Hence,
but they only had the terminology or concept of a horse.
Exactly. They only had the concept of the horse. They didn't have the concept of the rest of the things.
Yeah.
So that's where the alignment piece comes in. And if we think about that, not just from a services contract, but from all types of contracts, I think that becomes really important. I also think it's about tapping into our supply base. There was an article that Tim Cummins wrote. It came out, I think, last week, 2 weeks ago. And it was talking about our dependency of taking things to market all the time, as opposed to tapping into the supply base. I think that's where we start to think about how do we align with our suppliers and tapping into where the innovation's going, and how do we then work with those suppliers to get innovation coming into us so that our end customer becomes ultimately satisfied, beyond satisfied from where they were thinking. That for me is where we start, is broadening our mindset out from
Yeah.
the traditional ways of, well, I've got to run a tender. Well, it's IT outsourcing, so there's only 3 suppliers in the world that can do every single part of it. Let's change that concept to go, well, actually,
Yeah.
why am I segmenting the totality of a category instead of the individual subcategory? Is there more value in the subcategory? Would I
Yeah.
treat
At the very
subcategory
least,
A?
more choice.
Yeah. Would
Yeah.
I treat subcategory A different than subcategory B? Well, the likelihood is you would. So then you've got a strategic choice to make, right?
Yeah.
Around, if I group them together, the traditional way of supply-based consolidation, well, then I'm going to get outcome A. Is that what I want? Or is it outcome B? Yeah. Outcome B is more things to manage. Yeah. But is the value that I get greater than the time I'm
Yeah.
going to have to spend in managing it? Or how do I use, I work for a technology company, but I'm a procurement guy as well. How do I then use technology to help automate as much of those as I possibly can? And I
Yeah.
think that something is important.
Yeah. And there's one piece that I want to make sure we touch on before we wrap. To me, it's the idea of formality, right? And I'll acknowledge, right? I ended up in sourcing professional services, I think, because I was too new and I didn't know enough to push to not be put there, right? But I've always considered that a huge advantage, because if you learn to source on services, everything else is like, wait, you can measure it and weigh it and say exactly what color it has to be. Well, I mean, it has its complexities, but it's a different kind of challenge than we
Yeah.
talked about, the subjectivity and the perception associated with services. My read is that a lot of what we discovered as opportunities in this research ultimately comes back down to formality. And whether it's really digging into the service to understand, yes, it's a service, but there are specific outcomes, depending on the type, or there must be some sort of KPI that is appropriate to use in measuring the relative success or effectiveness of this service. Do you have any advice for procurement teams that want to become more mature, specifically around how they manage services spend, just for getting that started?
Oh, crikey. I don't know. I didn't necessarily. The great thing about these things being unscripted is that I don't necessarily know what you're going to ask me. So as a result, I can't be as planned as that. But so, advice around becoming more mature. I mean, there's 2 general schools of thought, right? You get more mature by doing it. You
Yep.
get more mature by talking to people who have done it and embracing some of the things. You also can leap by thinking about, by changing the mindset some way. So I'll broaden this out a little bit. When organizer to get more mature, you generally have to follow a bunch of steps. Yeah, well, first of all, we're going to try and centralize our processes, and then after we've centralized our processes, we're going to try and apply them to everything, and we're going to manage by exception, and then we're going to see if we can take our processes, and we love our processes; they're all nice and give us safety and comfort. But I need to get better at it, so I'm going to digitize those processes. And then after you digitize those processes, you go, I'm not getting as much value as I thought about that, because I'm using manual processes in a digital world. So then you evolve that to go, well, actually, how do I get best use of it? Which, by the way, is where we are now from a digitization perspective.
By
People
and
go,
large, yeah.
oh, I've actually got to think about how I get better value out of the things that I'm doing, and I might actually have to change the inputs to get the outputs working the way I want it. Or you can jump to the end and just go, everything, as it Yoda says, unlearn what you have learned.
Yeah.
And start with a completely fresh kind of digital piece. And that's where I'm kind of, and I know it's a central theme for me on this, is to go, if we are customer centric in our mind and thinking about what we're trying to deliver to our customer, and that's going to require us to be A, aligned to our customer, but B, aligned to our product. If we're in a manufacturing environment, into our production, be aligned to where we're going to take them, so into our R&D.
Yep.
That's going to require us to really sit within the business much more than I think we think about. And I think thinking about, how does this service that we're buying translate to what we want our customers? And I spend a lot of time in healthcare. So I'm going to give you another example of that. You basically have anything that sits what we call, like almost like behind the curtain. You've got the public areas, and then you've got the
You're
patient
right.
areas. So when you think about just think about if you're a patient in a hospital, you are at your most vulnerable. That means that everyone that you come into contact with, you want to be able to trust. That's a different scope of works than cleaning a window.
Yes, it is.
And that's where it's being really customer centric. Start to think about the value how you're going to measure. That's not
Yeah.
a cost saving measure. Yeah. That's does that patient feel comfortable in that? Now, how are you going to measure that? You know what I mean? That's where it starts to be different. And then how are you
Yes.
going to
And
pay
that's
for that?
very complex.
Yeah. And that to me, that's where I think procurement, I know when I was in procurement, that's where I wanted to play. Those are the conversations that I wanted to have. Those are the things that goes, all right, well, let's strategically think about how we put this contract in place and how do we measure that it's working. Yes, cost savings are vitally important. They are what my old boss used to call the day job. You're not going to get away from that. But you
Yeah.
first of all got to make a strategic decision that says, is the outcome of this contract around saving money, or is it about something else? And I
Yeah.
think the minute we have those types of conversations, the maturity level increases massively because it's a different conversation. And trust me, the business is wanting us to have those conversations with them. They're wanting to be challenged. They're wanting
Yeah.
to have that discussion around insource, outsource. Those are the types of things that I think that's where the fun is.
Yeah. And hopefully, as the full report comes out, which is in just a couple of weeks, everybody here will certainly be notified once it's available. Hopefully, we're giving people the information, the inspiration, right, needed to go and be prepared to have those conversations, because that's truly where the procurement upside is. It's only by moving up into that next level where you're having the most critical conversations, where the value opportunity is the greatest. That is where I think all of us want to be headed, and it aligns with what you said earlier about confidence level.
Yeah.
So, Gordon, as expected, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being here today, for being part of the analysis, helping us create this survey, and of course, helping us break down the results.
Oh, it's been a joy. This is a pet subject of mine. Is again, and as you say, what we're trying to do here is inspire people just to think a little differently, just to start thinking about how am I going to have a different conversation. And if we can do that, then for me, it's job well done.
Yep. And if you were one of those people who has either joined us now live or joined us later on demand because you're looking for that inspiration, we're so glad you chose to spend some time with us. Thank you very much for signing up, for listening, for watching. We hope you will look for the report when it comes out, and we look forward to having you participate in future Art of Procurement events. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.